Jigs are probably the #1 bait for catching big bass ever invented. But there are a lot of different ways you can actually modify jigs to get more bites and bigger bites. So if you're struggling to catch bass on jigs, stay tuned to this video because we're going to have 3 different anglers share their best jig modifications on different styles of jigs to help you put bigger bass and more bass in the boat this year. Let's get into it. I'll get us started by sharing how I modify my go-to offshore bait, the Fish the Moment offshore jig. This is a 5/8 ounce football jig that I designed for Jewel Bait Company, and it has a very unique design which allows it to be modified in a lot of different ways to match different fishing conditions and the time of year that you're fishing. In this video, I'm going to share how I modify this jig for fishing in the late fall and early winter. Also get into the trailer I use and all of my equipment, so let's get into it. Okay, so here we have the Fish the Moment offshore jig by Jewel Bait Company. And the first thing you'll notice about this jig is how long the skirt is. And a lot of guys might think that I actually fished this jig out of the package with this long skirt, but that's not true at all. The reason I designed this jig with such a long skirt is to give you the option to customize it based on the conditions. I actually only fish it with this really long skirt about 10% of the time in the middle of the summer when it's as hot as possible. But when we're getting into the colder months of the year, water temperatures are 60, maybe 50 degrees, I'm going to trim up the skirt to match the forage of the bass, which is going to be crawfish. The way I'll do this is actually take my scissors and trim that skirt so that it's just below the bottom bend of the hook. So I'm going to take my scissors, I'm going to trim that skirt up, and I'm going to cut off all of that excess. That makes that jig a lot shorter than it was before, and again, you can change that skirt length based on the conditions and the seasons of the year. When it's getting colder, you want a more compact skirt. The other thing that is nice about this jig is that we designed the skirts that it has some shorter strands up at the top. If I was going to trim up a regular skirt, I would actually trim some of the skirt a little bit shorter so that it has that finesse jig flare out, but the way we designed this jig, it has that already built in, which saves you some time. Now that we have this nice compact profile, we're going to be matching crawfish a lot better, which is great for these colder months of the year. The next thing we have to do is actually adjust the cable guard that comes on this Fish the Moment offshore jig. A double cable guard is a lot better at coming through brush and wood than any other weed guard on the market, and it makes this jig extremely weedless and come through cover really well. What you have to do out of the package with this weed guard is actually spread it apart. It'll kind of come stacked on top of each other, so I will spread that weed guard out with my hands so that it is covering both sides of the hook point. That way, when it comes across a tree limb, those guards will block the hook point from the wood. Another thing you need to do with this cable guard is raise up the guards higher if you're fishing in a lot of wood or maybe standing timber. The higher those cable guards are, the more weedless it is coming through wood. However, when you're dragging this jig around rocks, you actually don't want those cable guards to be as high because it will kind of stop the fish from getting a good bite on that hook. So you actually want to push the cable guards down closer to the hook point when you're fishing around rocks because it'll allow those fish to get a better bite on that jig while still keeping it relatively weedless. The great thing about those guards is, again, you can adjust it based on the cover you're fishing, but you do have to remember that. In wood, raise the guards up. In rock, push them further down. Now that we have our jig trimmed up in the proper way, we now have to add our trailer. And just like this really versatile offshore jig that I designed for Jewel, I also designed a very versatile trailer. This is the Jewel VersaCraw Junior trailer. And the reason I designed this trailer is because I wanted to have one trailer that fits any situation. If you look at this trailer, it has some bigger claws on the outside and some smaller claws on the inside. And you can remove all of these little tabs in here to get a very lifelike, very aggressive movement from this trailer. But because we're getting into the colder months, we don't necessarily want a ton of action from this trailer. We want something that's more similar to a chunk style trailer. So to do that, all I'm going to do is break apart the center gates on this trailer. And with that, you basically have a little chunk, just like you would like a super chunk from Zoom or something similar there. Now, if we wanted to get more action again, you could remove the inside gates here between these tails, and it would give it a lot of extra action. But when that water temperature is below 70 degrees, I like to just take out those inner gates, use more of this chunk style approach, and it works great on the back of this football jig. Now all we have to do is put this trailer on the jig. It's designed as a jig trailer, this VersaCross, so it fits perfectly. Just thread it all the way on, just like that. Has a nice keeper system on that jig that'll keep that trailer nice and snug. And if you look at that jig now, it's going to be perfectly set up to imitate a crawfish. The trailer is still very visible at the bottom of that jig. The strands of the skirt are not covering up those legs, which is really important. And also we have a very subtle action from that trailer because we just removed those 2 center gates. This is my go-to setup for fishing in the late fall and the early winter with a football jig offshore, and this has caught me a ton of big fish over the last few years with this exact setup. In terms of the gear I throw with this jig, I usually throw it on a Denali 7'2" heavy action worm and jig rod. This is a pretty stout rod. It allows me to get a good hook set with that football jig, pull them out of rocks, out of brush very easily. And I'll pair that with some 16 to 18 pound Sunline FC Sniper fluorocarbon, and I'll put that with a 6-3-1 Abu Garcia Black Max reel, $50 reel. So if you guys are interested in any of the equipment I've talked about here, we'll link it down in the description. You can get these jigs over at jewelbait.com. It's the only place you can find them. You can also pick up the VersaCross there or over at Tackle Warehouse as well. Now let's get to our next jig modification.
A jig is one of my absolute favorite baits to fish. I have grown up fishing a jig on rivers and impoundments that are just full of heavy cover, which means a jig is going to be one of the best baits that you can use. So I want to show you guys how I prep a jig right out of the package, because I do not use one straight out of the package as is. There's a lot of changes that I like to do. This is one of my favorites. This is a compact pitch and jig by Dirty Jigs in the pond bug colors, basically like an electric blue with a green pumpkin color skirt. So what I like to do with this, a couple of things to mention right out of the package. One of the first things that I always do is I look at the skirt. So the skirt is going to be something that I think you want to trim down right out of the package. In this case, this skirt is probably 1 inch to 1.5 inches past the bottom of the hook. As you can see, in my opinion, that's too long. That's going to create a lot of drag in the water. It's almost going to limit the motion that the skirt makes, because keep in mind, the shorter the skirt, the more flare you get from the skirt. So by leaving it long, it'll actually create less motion overall. It'll create less bulk for the bait as well. It'll look more bulky, but it kills the motion of the bait. So the first thing that I like to do is I like to trim the skirt so that it's probably about, I'm gonna say, 1/2 inch below the hook shank. So I'm gonna just take it and trim it right across the bottom. Now, you can see I've done that, and I've got about 1/2 inch. There's a couple of longer strands here. Now, I don't like how that just is cut right across the bottom. It's kind of what my wife says if I cut my kid's hair, that she says, do not cut it straight across so you get a bowl cut. Well, I don't want a bowl cut on my jigs either. So one of the things I'm gonna do is I'm gonna actually cut some of the strands out from the bottom side of the skirt. So you can see you've got your skirt collar, you've got the top, and you've got the bottom. Well, the bottom is laying just flat against the hook shank. You don't get much flare out of that because the skirt collar is just keeping it tight. Your flare comes from the skirt material on the top of the jig, because that's got to hang over the jig, the skirt collar. So I like to cut out some of the bulk of the bait. So that's going to do a couple of things. It's going to let the skirt flare more, and it's going to create a slimmer profile, which is going to usually allow the bait to fall a little bit faster. Now, if I'm fishing very muddy water, I may leave the skirt as is, but I'm going to cut out about 1/4 of the material that comes out underneath the collar. So I'm not doing this precisely. I just go in and I kind of cut some chunks out from some various places. I try to make it a little thinner in various places. So you can see I've cut out a decent amount of material there. So that's going to allow the whole skirt to breathe better. It's also going to give it a much slimmer profile. So you can see just by trimming the skirt up, from taking the weight and the length off the bottom, as well as cutting out some of these underneath tabs, I've got a much more translucent skirt that flares better. Now the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go in on an angle and cut out some of these bottom pieces just to give it a more irregular look. Might come up a little higher on some of the sides. Okay. So now I've really trimmed that skirt down, but you can see as soon as you take off some of those longer ones, you get more flare. Well, that's what I want, because that flare is what's going to give me motion in the water. So that's how I like my skirts. I like them really short. The other reason I trim it down a bunch is because when you put a trailer on the bottom, if your skirt material comes in contact with the kicker legs of your trailer, it's going to kill the motion. You will not get that motion. So I want to make sure that the movement part of my trailer is below the skirt material. So that's how I trim my jig, just like that. The next thing I'm going to do is I move over to the weed guard. The weed guard, in my opinion, should be about a 1/4 inch over the tip of the hook. And in this case, that's probably 3/8 of an inch. So I'm going to take just maybe a 1/16 inch. I'm going to spread it out, and I'm just going to take a little bit. Oh, I missed one. Okay, so I've trimmed it down just a little bit, taken about a 1/16 of an inch off, but that's perfect. So for me, generally speaking, if you push down the weed guard, I want it to go to about the barb of the hook. And you can see, so that's perfect. The next thing I'm gonna do is I take about 4 or 5 pieces of the fiber weed guard material from the bottom, and I cut those off at the base. So you can see it just pops them out. Take my scissors down to the bottom, and I cut those off. And the reason I do it from the bottom is because I still want a little bit of that resistance that the bottom material is going to make, so it keeps it very much weedless. But when it comes to the tip, what I've just done is thinned out the fiber material at the tip, which really allows me to have better hookups. Now, some of you might say, well, why not just pluck them out fully? I don't pluck them out fully for 2 reasons. One, occasionally, if you were to pull those 4 or 5 fiber weed guards out, the whole entire weed guard will pop out. Well, I don't want that. The other reason I don't do it is because if I pluck them out completely, perfectly, where I have 4 or 5 full strands come out, what that does is it creates a gap underneath the fiber material so that it actually can get pushed down easier. It takes away some of that weedlessness. So I like to do that. This is how I do it. Everyone does it a different way, but I take it off the bottom because that still gives it some strength at the base, but it's a very soft tip. The last thing I'll do with the weed guard is I'll fan it out a little bit. I don't want it fanned out so it's just completely all over the place, but I want it fanned out so it looks about like that. It's probably 3/8 of an inch spread out, and then that way, when the fish bites it, I don't have nearly as much interference from the fiber weed guards. The last thing I'll do is I'll take my trailer. So depending on what trailer you like to use, you can trim it down if you want, not trim it down. In this case, this is a 4-inch Berkley Pit Boss, which is one I like to use. I also really like to use the 3-inch, but in this case, I want a little bit more bulk because I'm fishing dirtier water, so I'm gonna stick with the 4-inch, but I'm gonna cut off the top half, and I do it so that I've got a little bit of an angle. I shouldn't say top half. I cut off probably 3/4 of an inch, but I do it so I've got a point there, and that just allows the bait to come through the water a little bit better. And then I like to thread my bait up onto the bait. And the reason I do that is because if I want my bait to move more from a jig standpoint and glide more in the water, I want my bait to be all connected as one. If you were just to take say a chunk and nose hook it, that bait's gonna fall much more vertical because that free swinging chunk is going to keep the bait from gliding. It works as an anchor. If you were to slide up a trailer, like in this case, it's all part of the jig, so it's actually going to glide a little bit more. So that just kind of comes down to what type of water you're fishing. But that's my finished jig right there, guys. That's what I'm going for. I like a small, compact profile with a thinned out weed guard, a thinned out skirt. It just seems to give the bait more motion. It makes it look much more realistic in the water. And that's what I'm going for.
If you're struggling to find productive areas on your lake or are new to fishing and want to get pointed in the right direction about where to start fishing, head to our website, fishthemoment.com, and go to our lake breakdowns page. Here you'll find lake breakdowns from myself, Randy Blaukat, and Matt Stefan. I focus on offshore breakdowns, Matt covers smallmouth, and Randy covers shallow water largemouth. These lake breakdowns provide 40 GPS waypoints that you can transfer straight to your fish finder. We give detailed area descriptions, the best conditions to fish each area, lure recommendations, and key strategies for the lake in general. We also give you a guide on how to transfer the waypoints straight to your fish finder, so you don't have to worry about the technology gap there. You can scroll through and find breakdowns for all 4 seasons of the year, and we have a lot of lakes here, so you probably will find most of the major lakes in this list already. However, if you scroll all the way down to the bottom and don't see your lake in one of the 4 seasons, you can also get a personal lake breakdown from either Randy or Matt at the bottom of the page, and you can pick any lake in the country and get 40 waypoints picked out personally by Matt or Randy. Check out our lake breakdowns at fishthemoment.com.
Today I'm going to give you guys some tips and advice on how to modify my Blaukat old school jig to make it more versatile under a wide range of conditions. You know, jigs are they're either my favorite or my second favorite lure. I probably in tournaments have won more money on jigs than any other lure that I fished out there. And there's some things that I do to each one of my jigs to make them really a little bit more suited to the technique that I'm fishing with the particular jig. So I'm going to go through, show you guys exactly what I do to most all my jigs here. Okay, first of all, let's get into the weed guard a little bit. Now, the weed guard on my jig here, it comes, you know, with a full set of fibers like this. And this is good, guys, if you're fishing heavy cover, like if you're flipping into thick trees or bushes where you need the maximum amount of you know, hook of weedlessness, that type of thing. But one of the things you can do here, and one of the things I like to do if I'm fishing sparser cover, say if I'm fishing around isolated stumps or on rocks or around boat dock pilings, that type of stuff, is I come in with a pair of scissors and I'm going to remove about half of the fibers here. So I'm coming in like this, I'm cutting about half of them out like that, where I've got half the fiber there. Now what this does, it's less mass there to get in the way of hooking that fish. Ideally, if you can get away with it, you don't even need a weed guard. A weed guard is just to keep the bait from getting hung up, but it will impede the hook set a little bit. So first thing I do is I trim it back to suit the cover that I'm fishing, and also I'll take it and I'll just spread it out slightly like this. It gives a little bit more coverage like that, and it makes it a little bit more weedless. Now the next thing I do is sometimes I want a full skirt and sometimes I want to trim it back a little bit, depending upon the trailer that I'm using. So I'm going to give you guys 2 different scenarios here. If I'm using a chunk, this is like a Zoom Super Chunk. If I'm putting it on just by hooking it like a pork frog or something, where it's longer, I usually don't trim the skirt. I usually leave it long because I want the body of that trailer to be covered up, you know, by the skirt a little bit to just where you can see the legs there. So a lot of times I'll leave it full. But if I want a smaller profile, a little bit more compact, what I do is I'll thread the trailer on, and it's going to make the bait a little bit more compact, and then we got to trim the trailer. So for example, you can see right here, this is the same jig, but now you have more of the body of the trailer covered up by the skirt. So we want to take some of that off. So basically take a pair of scissors, and you don't want to just cut like straight across. You don't want a uniform cut. You want to come in and just take out bits and pieces of it here, because you want some short strands and you want some long strands. You want to give it sort of this gnarly looking look a little bit. I don't want any type of uniformity. So I'm going through there, clipping it off, making it a little bit ununiform. And then what this does is it gives me more of my trailer exposed here. My jig is more compact and profile. So sometimes if I'm fishing tougher fishing conditions or the fish don't want a bigger jig, I'll trim it back like that. Another thing I do is taking fibers out of your jig can increase or slow down the fall. If you have a full skirt like this, the jig will fall slower, but you can also come in here and pick out part of the skirt, take out some of that skirt material, and it will cause the jig to fall a little bit quicker. And sometimes I'll do this if I'm in a little bit clearer water. I want a little bit more finessey look. So that's the main thing, guys. Pretty simple approach. Trim the weed guard, trim the skirt back to match your trailer on there, pull some of the strands out, and that's just simple jig modification that will add up to more bites for you guys. So we'll see y'all next time.
That's it for this video, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed our jig modifications. If you want more content like this on the Bass Fishing Declassified YouTube channel, leave a comment down below. We can talk about how we modify a bunch of different baits and give you some tips and tricks to put more bass in the boat. Thanks again for checking out this video. We'll see you all in the next one.